You went to the appointment. You took the pills. You cut the salt. You did the walk every morning. And you sat down at the cuff, and the number was still too high. That's not a failure of effort. That's a failure of information. Here's what I've found after years of digging through the research on blood pressure and aging. Most people over 60 are only working on about half the picture. They're managing the obvious stuff and completely missing the pieces that actually move the needle when the obvious stuff isn't enough. Today, I'm going to walk you through 5 of those pieces. And I want you to stay for the last one because it's the one that surprised me most. A treatment that, in one of the largest global trials ever done on this, lowered blood pressure by nearly 10 points when standard approaches had already failed. I'll explain exactly what it is and who it might be right for. Don't skip ahead. Let's start at the beginning. Before we get into it, if you find yourself nodding along today, subscribing is honestly just how you let me know there's a real person on the other side of this. That little signal is what tells me to keep going. It takes about 2 seconds. Okay, let's get into the research. Let's start with something that might already be sitting on your kitchen counter or your fridge shelf right now. Most people know salt raises blood pressure. What most people don't know is how much sodium they're actually eating, because a huge chunk of it isn't coming from the salt shaker. It's buried inside processed foods as preservatives and additives that you'd never guess were there. A major study published just recently, covering more than 112,000 people, found that common food preservatives are directly linked to higher blood pressure and increased risk of heart-related disease. Not just sodium as a nutrient, but specific chemical additives used to extend shelf life. The American Heart Association has long emphasized that the majority of sodium in the average American diet comes from packaged and restaurant food, not from cooking at home. And their guidance points to a target of no more than 1,500 milligrams per day for people with high blood pressure. Yet most people are eating well over double that without realizing it. A woman named Corinne, 64, a retired school librarian, came across this idea when she was frustrated that her numbers hadn't changed even after months of eating better. She hadn't touched the salt shaker in a year, but when she started actually reading labels, she found her favorite deli turkey, her canned soups, and her store-bought bread were loading her with sodium before noon. Within about 3 weeks of switching to mostly whole foods and fresh proteins, she said her readings started coming down for the first time in years. The practical move here is simple but requires discipline. Read the ingredient list, not just the front label. Look for sodium nitrite, sodium benzoate, and disodium phosphate. Those are the preservative names to watch. And aim to keep your daily sodium under 1,500 milligrams if your doctor has flagged hypertension. Now, here's something that genuinely caught my attention when I read the research, because it goes against what most people assume about exercise and blood pressure. We've always been told that cardio, walking, cycling, swimming, is the go-to for heart health. And it absolutely helps. But a recent Harvard Health summary on blood pressure and exercise found that isometric exercises, things like wall sits and static hand grip holds, may actually produce stronger blood pressure reductions than aerobic exercise alone in people with hypertension. Isometric exercise is when a muscle contracts and holds, without movement. A wall sit is the clearest example. You lower yourself to a seated position against a wall, hold for 30 to 60 seconds, rest, and repeat. That's it. The mechanism is real. Sustained muscle contraction followed by release triggers a drop in vascular resistance, meaning your blood vessels relax more after that held tension releases. Over weeks of consistent practice, that translates to measurable reductions in resting blood pressure. This doesn't mean abandon your walk. Walking is still excellent, especially for metabolic health and mood. But if you've been walking faithfully and your numbers are still stuck, adding 2 or 3 sets of wall sits several times a week might be the missing piece your routine needs. Start with 20 seconds and build up. And if you have knee issues, talk to your doctor or physical therapist before adding this. There are modified versions that reduce joint load. And this connects directly to something most people have never been told to look at, even though it's right there on your blood pressure monitor every single time you take a reading. When you see your blood pressure result, you see 2 numbers. The top number, systolic, the bottom, diastolic. Most people focus on the top number, but there's a third number hiding in plain sight, and it turns out it may be one of the most important readings for brain and heart health after 60. It's called pulse pressure, and you calculate it in about 3 seconds. Just subtract the bottom number from the top. If your reading is 138/78, your pulse pressure is 60. A June 2026 report highlighted research suggesting that pulse pressure, not just the individual readings, may be a key signal for cardiovascular and brain health, particularly in older adults. A higher pulse pressure, generally above 60, can be a sign that the arteries have stiffened, which is a separate issue from just having high blood pressure overall. Why does this matter? Because you could have a systolic reading that's borderline, feel like you're doing okay, and still have a pulse pressure that's telling a different story about what's happening inside your arteries. The practical step here is to write down both numbers every time you monitor at home, calculate the difference, and bring that log to your next appointment. Ask your doctor specifically about your pulse pressure trend. It's not a diagnosis, it's a conversation starter that gives your doctor much more to work with. We're halfway through, and the next two are the ones I really want you to hear, because they're the most overlooked and the most actionable. But before we go there, quick question for you. When you take your blood pressure at home, do you write both numbers down, or do you just remember the top one? Drop a top or both in the comments. I read them, and it genuinely helps me understand where most people are starting from. Now we're getting into the pieces that really move the needle, and this one is about how care is delivered, not just what you do at home. The American Heart Association published findings in May 2026 on what they're calling community-based care for blood pressure, a model where pharmacists, community health workers, and care teams actively follow up with patients between doctor visits, adjust approaches in real time, and provide consistent education and accountability. And the numbers are significant. Programs using this approach have seen a 20% increase in patients getting their blood pressure under control, compared to standard care alone. Think about what that actually means. Not a new drug, not a procedure, just more consistent, personalized support, and 20% more people hitting their target. A man named Desmond, 68, a retired electrician who had been managing hypertension for almost a decade, told his story through a community health program. He'd been on two medications, seen his doctor twice a year, and his numbers were always borderline. When he joined a pharmacist-led follow-up program at his local pharmacy, checking in every few weeks, getting his medications reviewed, and getting help understanding what his readings actually meant, his systolic dropped steadily over 4 months to a range he hadn't seen in years. The practical application here is this. If your blood pressure isn't responding the way you hoped, ask your doctor whether a pharmacist consultation or a care team check-in program is available to you. Many insurance plans cover it. Many community health centers offer it free of charge. The gap between your appointments may be exactly where the problem is hiding. If you know someone who's been frustrated with their blood pressure numbers, a spouse, a sibling, a friend who just says it's just my age, sharing this video takes one tap and it might genuinely change what they bring up at their next appointment. That's worth something. But the one I'm about to share has surprised more people than anything else on this list, and it's the reason I wanted you to stay until the end. It's called renal denervation, and if you've never heard of it, you're not alone. Most people haven't. But for a specific group of people whose blood pressure stays dangerously high even after trying multiple medications, this is now a real option, backed by serious trial data. Here's what's actually happening inside your body when standard treatments fall short. In some people, the nerves running alongside the renal arteries, the arteries that supply your kidneys, are chronically overactive. They're constantly sending signals that tell your body to hold more fluid and raise pressure. Medication addresses the chemistry, but it doesn't quiet those nerves directly. Renal denervation does. The procedure uses a catheter, a thin, flexible tube, passed through a small entry point, usually at the wrist or groin. It delivers low-level energy to those renal nerves to reduce their activity. No surgery, no large incision, usually done in under an hour. Now here's the number that made me take this seriously. A large global clinical trial reported in April 2026 found that renal denervation lowered blood pressure by nearly 10 millimeters mmHg in patients who hadn't responded adequately to medication. In blood pressure terms, that is a clinically meaningful reduction. A woman named Vivian, 72, a former accountant, had tried 4 different blood pressure medications over 8 years. Each one either failed to bring her numbers down or caused side effects she couldn't tolerate. Her cardiologist referred her for renal denervation. She described the recovery as surprisingly straightforward, and within about 6 weeks, her readings had dropped into a range she hadn't seen in over a decade. This is not for everyone. It's specifically studied in people with resistant hypertension, meaning blood pressure that remains high despite being on multiple medications correctly. If that sounds like your situation, the conversation to have is with a cardiologist or hypertension specialist. Ask them directly whether renal denervation trials or approved procedures are available where you are. It's a real option, not a fringe idea, and the evidence base is growing fast. Here's what I want you to sit with for a moment. These 5 things aren't 5 separate answers, they're one system. Cutting hidden preservatives reduces the inflammatory load on your arteries. Isometric exercise trains your vascular system to release tension. Tracking pulse pressure gives you and your doctor a clearer map. A community care team fills the gap between appointments. And for the people who've genuinely tried everything, renal denervation offers a path that didn't exist at scale just a few years ago. None of them work as well alone as they do together. And none of them require you to give up on the medications and lifestyle work you're already doing. They stack on top of what you're already doing and make the whole system more effective. So let's walk back through this quickly. We talked about hidden preservatives and how to read labels for the sodium you can't see. We talked about isometric exercise, specifically wall sits, and why Harvard's research suggests they may do more for blood pressure than a walk alone. We covered pulse pressure, the third number on your monitor that your doctor may not be asking about yet. We looked at the community care model and how consistent follow-up is producing real results for people who were stuck on standard care. And we ended with renal denervation, a procedure that's showing genuinely significant results for people with resistant hypertension. If you're only going to try one thing this week, start with the notepad. Write down both numbers every time you take a reading. Calculate the difference. Bring that log to your next appointment. That one habit alone changes the quality of conversation you can have with your doctor. Your body isn't broken. It's waiting for the right information. And so often is your doctor. I spend a real amount of time tracking down research like this, and knowing you watch to the end honestly means a lot. If this felt useful, that subscribe button is just your way of telling me you're out there. And I genuinely hate for you to miss what I'm covering next, because I'm going into the specific blood pressure targets that the latest 2026 guidance says may be wrong for people over 70. That one is going to surprise a lot of people. This channel is for general educational purposes only. Always consult your doctor or qualified healthcare provider before making changes to your diet, exercise, or supplement routine.